I'm aiming to show you how to take photographs, not only you, but your staff as well, because it is a team thing, and if the staff can free up the dentist's time, so much the better. Just a brief potted history of my background. I spent 30 years literally up the road in a totally private practice, but basically general dentistry. So this is my first specific lecture to orthodontists and on photography for orthodontics. I was an advisor here between 1991 and 1996. And if any of you were around in 1993, as I'm sure most of you were, John Hunt and I got screwed by Tom Mangold on Panorama on amalgam. I left the surgery up the road in 98 to become a dental reference officer. And for those who are not familiar with the system over here, the NHS had a system which basically monitors NHS standards. The CQC made me redundant December 2010. They decided that they don't want any dentists looking at dental surgeries. I've been an honorary clinical teacher at the Eastman for some time, and last year I've become a dental consultant to GlaxoSmithKline. So that's me in the proverbial nutshell. So what I'm aiming to do is make dental photography simple and predictable. And I'm going to talk about one system only, which I consider the ideal system. It's a digital single lens reflex camera, the appropriate macro lens, and the appropriate flash system. I'm going to tell you why I advise that particular system, show you how it's set up, help you choose equipment if necessary, and we'll end with a demonstration of the system in use. So by close of play today, and actually I ought to compliment my son on this photograph. It's not one that I took. I replaced my sunset with his. But I want to take you basically from the camera setup to be able to take this type of shot on a constant quality and repetitive basis. So where are we going to start? Well, firstly, before you even pick up your camera, patient consent is absolutely mandatory these days, and as far as I'm concerned, it has to be a signature and not a nod, a wink, and a handshake. The dental board, I actually introduced photography to the Dental Reference Service. I couldn't understand why we didn't have cameras, and they came up with A and B. In today's world, I've added C, because I think it's most important that if you are going to use your photographs in a practice leaflet or in any other way, then the patients know about it. You don't want to find your photograph on an advert somewhere and your patient rattling at your door, "You must have got money for that, I want my share." So, in my opinion, starting at the end, standardized views are important to you. These are views of faces, parts of faces, groups of teeth that you can photograph at a consistent and reproducible size. Because I normally speak to GDPs, I bring in the 12 BACD, AACD views, which are required. And basically, you need one setting on your camera for full face, you need one for full smiles, full arches, and one for a sextant. That's only 3 changes on your camera. So we'll just very rapidly go through the BACD views from the full face, a full arch without retraction, a lateral full smile, t'other lateral, a full arch retracted, a lateral view retracted, the other lateral view retracted, occlusal upper and lower. Chris Orr could do those 12 in 2 minutes because I've watched him do it. So I've never timed myself, I don't think I will, but it's not a difficult procedure. The sextant views, in fact, you will not need. Now, you all had a leaflet, as I did, or a little paper given to us a couple of days ago, and this is now, as far as you can confirm with me that for an orthodontic shot is better than that one. Is that correct? There was some mention in that paper of getting the clavicles in. So the only difference in taking that one and the other one is you're a bit further away. So the sextant views, I believe, are not required. Is that correct? So the orthodontic views, she's disappeared, but thank you, Yasmin, for emailing me a few shots. So they are full arches, lateral views, and occlusal views. Models as well, but they'll require the same settings as your camera anyway. So before I go into the clinical technique, I want to describe the ideal system. A digital single lens reflex camera. Now that's a Nikon. It's the body that is important. It doesn't matter whether it's a Nikon, Canon, or anybody else. The principle is exactly the same. Just out of interest, you can see the difference in quality between that one, which I took, and that one which I copied and pasted from a website. That one you can always lower to that standard, but you can never bring that one up to this standard. So always take a high quality picture initially. So there are two major players at the moment, Nikon and Canon. You can go down the Nikon line and buy a Nikon camera body, the Nikon lens and the Nikon flash system. Similarly, Canon. Independent manufacturers come in. Sigma is a typical one, and they will make lenses to fit Nikon and Canon. You can't fit a Nikon lens on a Canon body and vice versa. Also, flashes are not interchangeable, but the Sigma flash system, they'll do a flash for a Nikon or a Canon. I used to recommend the Sigma lens to go either with a Nikon or a Canon purely because it was £200 cheaper. The latest Nikon has got built-in vibration reduction or optical stabilization and has gone up in price by a couple of hundred. So the Nikon, Canon and Sigma lenses are all much the same in price. But Tamron have come in, not quite as sophisticated, but £200 to £300 cheaper, does the same job. So let's begin with the single lens reflex body. There is your basic digital camera. You have a light tight box, a lens on the front, a sensor and a screen at the back. Some of them, very few, have got an optical viewfinder at the top. But in general photography, you must appreciate your subject is invariably or always a lot larger than your image. When it comes to close-up photography, the image can be the same size, larger than the original or smaller, and that's why you need the special lens. So there's our image smaller than the subject, there it's the same size, there it's larger. So the single lens reflex is in fact basically very similar. You have a light tight box, you have a sensor, you have a screen at the back to view your image, you have a shutter, you have a lens, and the diaphragm or aperture, which I'll talk about more later, controls the amount of light coming through. So there's our subject. The important thing with this type of camera is that there is a mirror at 90 degrees to the sensor. On the top of the camera is a prism, and light from your subject will hit the mirror, go round the prism, and into the eye. So the eye sees what the lens sees. And I must say that I will make a point of virtually insisting that these cameras, because they're heavy, are always held up to the eye and not at arm's length. When you take the shot, the mirror flips up out of the way, the image is recorded on the sensor, which you will then see the right way round on the screen on the back, and when you release the shutter, everything goes back. You can still see your original subject. So literally what you see is what you get. That's a little bit more technical, and this one I put in specifically because here's our light path through the mirror and round the prism into the eye, but the mirrors are not 100% reflective, and some of the light goes through the mirror into the brain of the camera. And it's this brain that controls the exposure. Whether that is with a flash or daylight, whatever, it is the little brain inside the camera that controls the exposure. So once again, the emphasis is camera at eye level. Then you have a choice of what lens you're going to put on it. So I've mentioned before the appropriate macro lens, and basically the macro lens is just a lens of a fixed focal length. It's not a zoom, it has one focal length, and it will just focus much closer to a subject than a standard lens of the same focal length. That costs you the extra £200-300, that little facility. So if you took a standard 100mm lens, the closest it will focus is 3 meters, ideal for portraits, but you will not get any closer. The macro lens looks longer because invariably you're extending the lens away from the film, and you can get as close as 10 centimeters, therefore you can take all your intraoral shots. So just go back to GCE physics for a moment. If this lens had a focal length of 100mm, then the distance from there to there is 100mm when the lens is focused at infinity. Pop something closer to the lens, that can only bend light to a certain degree, so that subject would actually be in focus outside the back of the camera. So in order to focus on something closer, you move the lens away from the film or the sensor. So the limit as to actually how close you can get is how far you can extend the lens away from the back of the camera. So basically that is how a macro lens functions. It is moved a long way from the camera, and with a 100mm lens, that distance is also around about 100mm. Having said that you move the lens away from the film, the latest lenses have internal focusing and don't change their length at all. So why do we choose the 100? Other close-up lenses can have shorter or longer focal lengths. Some can be cheaper. The answer is very easy. If you use a wider angle, shorter focal length lens, you are going to, for want of a better term, distort the face. So also you will get the background clutter in the surgery. And now if you just compare the width of the nose to the width of the nose here. So if you're going to achieve anatomical normality, then you must use a longer focal length lens for portraits. Granddaughter's always getting in the picture if she can, but she looks a lot better with the right lens on. Now, funnily enough, I had the book that Phil Wander and I wrote in 1987, and I've just photographed this from that book. Same face, same set of study models, taken with 3 different focal length lenses. Now, I don't know how much you're going to charge for maxillary expansion. I can do it very quickly and very cheaply. And facial orthopedics too. So we need that lens, good working distance, and correct perspective. Just to remind you, ballpark figures, the closest distance you will get with any lens is the equivalent of the focal length. So if you have a 28mm focal length lens, you'll have a working distance of 28mm. Increase it to 60, increase it to 100, and 150. So now we come to the flash system. And we'll explain, or I'll explain, how the modern flash system works. Over here we have our subject, and over here we have a diagrammatic version of the camera. So the typical flash system, which you've seen outside, has a power pack on the top and the flash system going around the lens. When you fire the flash gun, you get an initial pilot flash. You will probably only see one flash, but in fact there are 2. That light is reflected from the subject, goes through the lens and whatever aperture you've chosen, and I'll use that word aperture time and time again, and the little brain here will measure the amount of light, calculate how much light is needed to illuminate the subject correctly, and it will do that in 20 millionths of a second. So that is a typical macro flash. I tend now to call it macro flash rather than ring flash, because the original flash guns, ring flashes, were a ring. They had a circular flash tube going round there. The modern ones use 2 separate tubes, one there, which does have a number of advantages. So let's work out how they function in today's cameras. That's the typical flash gun that will go on the top of the camera, and that's the Sigma flash again. Canon make flash systems, they're around 600 and 400. This one has 2 flash tubes, that has 2 flash tubes further apart on a ring around the lens. That's the Nikon. Now, one of the nice things about the Nikon system is you don't need a hefty power pack, because you can trigger these flash guns by the flash on the top of the lens or by a command unit, but there are no wires, that's all wireless. That's the METS, that's all it is, no power pack. Fits around the lens, is triggered by the flash on the top of the camera. I haven't used it a lot. The downside is that it only has twin AAA batteries, so the life is not that long in the surgery, and also it doesn't turn itself off. So if you inadvertently leave it on and you come to your next patient, you've got flat batteries. That's the latest one I've come across. It's about 150, 200 pounds cheaper than the Sigma, and so far it's proved very reliable. Again, it's typical power pack and ring flash. But why bother with this type of flash unit when the camera's already got one on the top? But number one is, pop your subject down there, most of the light is going to miss your subject anyway, and you'll get a shadow. You can put a big flash gun on the top and you'll get the same effect. So you want the flash on the lens axis. Now, you're putting a kit together. Where are your choices of purchasing? One way comes to mind, and that's the web. Because their items on the web are far, far cheaper, or invariably a lot cheaper, than those sold in the high street shops. But what would you do if you Google an item and you find 9 of them as being sold at 500 and one sells at 350? Can anybody suggest a pitfall? Ever heard of a grey import? I went onto the web and found a site that was selling Tamron lenses about £200 cheaper than anybody else. So I thought, well, I can't lose, I'm paying for it by a credit card. It arrived 3 days later, DHL, from Hong Kong, valued at $15 and labelled as a gift. Now, had that got caught up at customs, it would have been impounded until I'd paid the import duty. If it goes wrong, Tamron or the importers of Tamron UK will not look at it. It's a grey import, and that is one of the big problems of finding the cheapest source on the web. If you get a grey import, you can either lose it or have problems. So be warned. So we're going to use a separate flash gun, not the one that's built in. And if I pop this flash gun onto a Nikon, that will automatically select the correct shutter speed. If I pop a Canon flash onto a Canon, it won't. So those of you thinking, I've either got Canons or thinking about Canons, they do need a little bit more setting up than the Nikon. Not a lot, but a little bit. So you now only really have two variables to think about to control your exposure. Your shutter speed is fixed. The other variables for the minute I will say are fixed. So the only variable is the size of the hole in the lens, or the aperture, which is that bit there, which obviously in a camera is a circle. And it can go from a number 2.8, which is very large, to 22, which is very, very small. So obviously, if you're going to use a small hole, you're going to need more light. So the flash tube has got to be a light a bit longer than if it was that one, where you've got a large hole. So, important, think hard, study hard. The flash systems today are completely automatic and will adjust their exposure to the aperture selected by the dentist. So we can go very small or very large. So which one do we select? And the important answer is why. Here we go again with this shot. Now, I meant to change the colour last night, but didn't, I'm sorry. We have a very small aperture because that's the shutter aperture there. So that's the size of the hole, the size of that red line. So when you illuminate with the pilot flash, then the reflection comes back. It's going to go, that amount of light is going to go down here, trigger this brain. The brain's going to send a message back to the flash gun. I want you to last for a 50,000th of a second. And that's what happens. This time I've drawn the hole very large. It stops there and stops there. So this time you're going to need less light because that's going to allow more through. So there's your Wide hole, there's your little hole. Which aperture are you going to choose and why? Welcome to a thorny subject called depth of field. Anybody like to tell me what depth of field is? No volunteers? Yes. I thought you were saying. That's it. So you take that study model and are you happy? Hopefully not very. How about that one? The only difference was an aperture of 2.8 for that one and 22 for that one. So by and large, you will use the high number, the small aperture, for as many of your clinical photographs as you possibly can. So here we have a subject with a very wide depth of field. We're in focus from foreground to background. Here we have a subject with a very narrow depth of field. And the reason here it's narrow is, number one, obviously the aperture was quite large. It was taken in daylight, therefore I needed a very fast shutter speed to capture that. So we have fast shutter speed, potentially moving subject, wide aperture. That's a shot of the aperture ring from a very old camera at the top. Again, in daylight, fast shutter speed, wide open aperture, and look at the depth of field. Very, very shallow. But if you actually move round and have your subject parallel to the sensor, then the whole thing is in focus. So getting down to specifics, if you have an aperture of 2.8 with your current systems, you have a depth of field of about 3 millimeters. You shut it down to f22 and you're almost 2 centimeters. So, when it comes to clinical photography, you are going to use the highest f number, the smallest aperture you possibly can to maximize your depth of field. The flash systems are automatic and they will compensate for the aperture that you've selected, which is A on a Nikon and AV on a Canon. So, correct me if I'm wrong, there's a study model. Do you prefer the one on the left or the one on the right? Any idea how that was achieved? Here's our system. If you turn your flash gun from 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock to 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock and mask this flash gun off, you'll get more light at the top and a shadow underneath the incisal tips. Or you can go into the power pack and turn one of the flash guns off on its own control, but it's easier just to hold a piece of card and mask a flash gun off. Do you want to avoid shadows? If you do, you can put your models on a light box or use black card. So let's set up the system for your particular needs. Sarah Ravenscroft loaned me these shots, so they're shots she's taken. I presume the other shots you will need are lateral views, am I correct? Yep. Those are her selection. So you need, correct me if I'm wrong, a full face, profiles, 3/4 views, and intraorally a full arch, lateral views, and full upper and lower occlusals. Where are you going to take your full face shots? If you take them in the dental chair, first thing is make sure that the patient's eyes are level with the camera. And if you're going to take them regularly in the chair, I'd just make a note, spot on the floor where you stand to take that shot. And then you're going to get your facial views, same size, time after time after time. If you're going to take a face in the chair, what about all this? Not very attractive. So have your nurse have a grey-blue card or something similar just behind the headrest, between the headrest and the patient's head. And that way you get a shot like that. The alternative, if you have a suitable background in your surgery, light-coloured wall, or buy a piece of A2 card from an art shop, light grey, light green, light blue, and just have it on the wall at a convenient place. The one advantage of the chair is that if you're 4'6" and your patient is 6'12", 6'9", 10, whatever, you don't want to have your camera up like that. So if you've got a tall patient outside the chair, just sit them down. But ideally, you must have your camera level with the patient's eyes. A comment, what's the difference between the left one and the right one? Thank you, well spotted. Don't have your dental light illuminating the patient's face, because you'll just get a colour cast. I'm sorry these have got a watermark of Carestream, but I took all these shots for Carestream a couple of years ago for a DVD that never got produced, unfortunately. I bought, when I was in America, I had it posted here, a brilliant illuminated light box. It's very, very bright, but you get absolutely no shadows. Now, I had it shipped over, so it cost $75 to ship it here. The first one was $40, and it cost me £120 to send it back. So, if you're interested, I can get them for you, but just let me know. Or if you specifically want me to bring it in tomorrow, I'll bring it in. So then now we come to the intraoral views. Anterior with and without retractors, laterals with and without, or maybe just with, and the occlusal shots. Now, how important is image size consistency to you now? Yeah? Fine. Now, somebody in an email to me said, what about autofocus? Can I use my camera on autofocus? Well, in one word, as far as I'm concerned, the answer is no. There's your camera, and you want to take canine to canine. Further back, you want to take molar to molar. So you point your camera with autofocus at your subject, and what's going to happen? It's going to focus on the front teeth. So all the available depth of field this side of the point of focus is lost. So your point of focus should be here, which you can see when you're looking at camera eye level. Not quite as easy when it's there, and also if you're taking close-ups, you can't hold it that still. So that's where you want to be focused, and then you'll get your centrals to molars sharp. Some cameras are quite sophisticated, and you can move the point of focus in the viewfinder. So instead of seeing that little thing in the middle, you can actually move it to one side. And then when that, it will then focus on that area, or you can see where you focus at that area. But by and large, forget autofocus and do it all by eye. How do we get consistency? Very easy using that type of lens, and that's what I use to kick off with. If I were to take a photograph, you're looking my way, of you from here, I'd probably get your head and collar in. If I go back to here, I'm going to get your head and shoulders. And if I come down there, I'll get half your face. So, to stand in one spot and focus, you'll never be in the same spot all the time. So, you tell the camera or you tell the lens what you want to see. So you actually set your field of view on the lens before you start. So if you want a full arch, and I'll go into this in a bit more detail, you set the lens in the position for a full arch, and then you move the camera until you're in focus. So that way, time and time again, you'll be in the same size and the same place. So again, this has been set up for GDPs, if you like, but the principle is exactly the same. With the lens set at that point, i.e. that 1 to 3 is down here, you'll get a full arch. If you want 4 and a bit teeth, the sextant, you set it there. If you just want 2 teeth, you set it there. So, setting it 1 to 3, you'll get that. Setting it at 1 to 1.5, you'll get that. And at 1 to 1, you'll get that. So by and large, the only setting you will need is the equivalent of that one on whatever system you're using, because you're going to work with, by and large, full arches, or that field of view all the time. Accessories, you're going to need retractors, and you're going to need at least one mirror. And good clinical photography requires good retraction, and again, at least one good occlusal mirror. And you've got to have an interested assistant, because if they take their eye off the ball, your photographs can be ruined. They've got to know what you want. And retractors are far better than fingers. And by and large, lips and cheeks require different retraction. Now, who's the best person to put the retractors in? You, the nurse, or the patient? Any of us? Agreed. Those are typical and pretty universal. I tend to like these because you've got one end for the cheeks and you've got the other end to take the lips out of the way for occlusal shots. And that's obviously also available at child size. The self-spanning ones are available large adult, adult and child. And I've just come across these and I think they're super for lateral views. And if you crop in tight, you don't get the lip droop. Otherwise, you need a bit more retraction on this. We've got some retraction on this side, just to stop the lip falling down at the edge of that retractor. So one of those V retractor for lateral views and a standard retractor just to keep the lips out of the way on the other side. That's a useful one which I came across recently because it takes the lips to the cheeks out of the way. And look, no hands. We've got a mirror just balanced between the upper sevens and the lower teeth. A 3-in-1 just to stop the mirror defogging. There are lots of retractors for occlusal retraction or getting the lips out of the way. Those are contrasters, which more in the restorative field than orthodontics. Mirrors with a handle avoid fingers. Now, the Jacobi, which I've got out here, that's the one that comes out of the factory, but it will only fit adults. It's very uncomfortable even with an adult with small jaws. So they've made one for me where that bit's cut out and that will squeeze right down to a very small size. That's the ideal shot you want for an occlusal. You should go from the centrals to the mesial aspect of the sevens. That's what you aim for. You've seen that because I've only had that for a few weeks. It's pretty good. So we've got a series of retraction here. That's the Hilger retractor going in. And then you get the nurse with the mirror. And from there she can see exactly what the dentist needs to see. That's the doctor's eyes retractor. Now once the patient has got it in, then the nurse can adjust it. That gives you a rough idea of how close you get for a full arch shot. So let's think a little bit about your models that you're going to photograph. You don't need a studio. Just go to a local art shop and get an A4 pad of suitable colours. Tends to be blue. If you curve it up against a backstand, you don't get any creases. A couple of sellotape blocks will hold it in position, so there's nothing arty about this, and just pop the study model on it, take a photograph. Those were taken on a light box. So a consistency is about achieving successive images, same size, virtually in the same place, time after time after time. Now, that was an interesting one because I think if I was the editor, I wouldn't have published it. But they were taken either with two different cameras, or a zoom lens where that was set at the wide angle lens and that was set more towards the telephoto. But look at the difference at the canine width there and there. So really your befores and afters should be something like that. And my congratulations to George Ashton, who did the ceramic work. So we can repeat this again. If you want consistency, set what you want on the lens first, and then move in till you're in focus. Now, very easy on that Sigma lens where the numbers are engraved on the barrel. What do you do with a lens like this, where all you've got is a little window because nothing else moves, is the same numbers are inside that window. So you would set the new Sigma on 1 to 3 like that. The lens next to it is the Tamron, and the numbers are nowhere near as clear, and they're not engraved on the barrel. So what I've done is very easy, very simple, very cheap. Put a sticky label on it and mark the points on there. So I reckon that one setting will cover 99% of all your intraoral and model shots. How many of you are still on film on your X-rays and have got X-rays on film in the past that you want to digitize? Very easy. Use your clinical camera without the flash. Pop the X-ray on the light box and take a picture. I'm going to go into some subtle details of camera setting, which I've omitted at this particular point. It was Andrew Hyatt that did that endodontics, not me, so I can't take any praise for that one. The expensive way is a flatbed scanner with a transparency hood, but that's £600 worth. And then once you've done all your X-rays, you won't need it. So, okay, at this point, I've told you what type of camera to buy, what type of lens, and what flash gun. So if I give you all 3 boxes with a camera, lens, and flash gun, how many of you could go off and take decent pictures tomorrow? Fine. Okay. So I'm glad I'm here for the majority. This is what you need before you take your first picture. What quality do you require of your images? The white balance, the camera mode, the sensitivity, and are you going to use auto or manual focus? Well, we can scrap the last one for a minute, but let's talk about the others. Let's digress for a moment. How many of you have used a film camera? That's good. That's nice, because if I talk to foundation dentists, none of them have. Now, when you used film, it came in a cassette, you took a shot, the film wound on, you took another shot until you'd exposed all 36. So it was the film itself that got changed by the light. With a digital camera, the image is captured on a sensor, and then it's moved electronically from the sensor to a disc. Now, a 2 gigabyte disc will probably hold about 500 photographs. There are different qualities of disc because the image has got to go from the sensor to the disc. The better quality disc will take the image quicker. In the camera is also something called a buffer, which holds the images somewhere in space, because you can take with a series of shots or even movie shots. But Because you can take a lot of shots and it doesn't cost anything, I'm going to take you or show you all my holiday shots, all 1,000 taken at the Galapagos. So there's your sensor. That's where the image is captured. And it then goes from there into that little disc. And you'll read on your camera that it's got X million pixels. And a camera with 10 million pixels has got 10 million separate electronic elements on a sensor. And to a large degree, the number of pixels control the quality of your image. So let's suppose your sensor's only got 54 pixels. Then each pixel is going to average out the light that falls on it. And I suggest from now on that you just half close your eyes, because it does make a difference. So if we have a sensor with more pixels, you get more detail. And if you have more still, you get even more detail. And more still, which is now recognizable, but if you like, that's the final image. So the more pixels, the better the quality up to a point. So now we want to set the camera up, and that's the top view of, I mean, most of them look pretty much the same, but the facilities are there. First of all, this may sound stupid, charge the battery. And you've got an on and off switch. Let's look at the left-hand side of a Nikon. Quality. You're going to select a relatively high quality. The ISO is the sensitivity, and you're going to select a relatively low number because lower number ISO gives a higher quality image, and if there are questions on that, come back to me. And there's something called the white balance. And there's another control on the Nikon, which is in between spots at the moment, but it should be on S for single shots. So what quality do you want? Do you all know what RAW is? Yes? Hands up for no. Fine, okay. The RAW image is the nearest a digital camera can get to producing a negative. Which means that, let's jump ahead. When you see the image on the back of your camera, that image has been processed by the computer in the camera. The raw image has to be processed either by the camera software that comes with the camera or third-party software such as Photoshop. I used to suggest that if your camera had the capability, you shot in RAW and fine. And you sieved off all the RAW onto a separate drive, because they're the ones that would stand up in court because they haven't been manipulated. And you would use the fine for your patients and your surgery and your records. Having had a letter from Dental Protection basically saying that if you sign on headed paper that this image has been cropped or rotated or something, but nothing else, that will be acceptable in court. You don't have to go back to a raw image. So you can, if you like, forget that one. So you could either go raw plus fine or fine for the highest quality you can get. Because you can always reduce the quality, you can't make a poor image good. You can make a good image poor, but you can't go the other way around. So that's the quality covered. And obviously I don't use notes, so please, if I say something a bit quickly or you don't follow, just interrupt. It won't put me off. The next thing is white balance. Now, sensors are not as clever as the human eye, because it doesn't matter what illumination you've got in this room, you're writing on paper that's white. If I took a photograph of that paper with the wrong white balance setting, it could come out probably pink. So you set the white balance to your light source. Now, in this case, your light source is electronic flash. So you go into the appropriate setting on your camera, and you'll have that choice. So automatic is you let the camera do its own thing, which I don't particularly recommend. Daylight, cloudy, shade, tungsten, fluorescent, and flash. So that's the one you will select. ISO. If you use film, you know that slow film was a higher quality than fast film, but it needed more light. So Nikons actually don't go any lower than 200, so 200 is my sensitivity choice. And that should be S for single shots. The others, continuous slow, continuous high, if you like racehorses going over jumps, and live view is when you can actually look at your image through the back of on the screen at the back. So when you look at a screen such as this, that's set for program, which I would tend to use socially. The shutter speed is a 60th, the aperture is f4. There's 1.4 thousand shots remaining on the card. Battery needs a recharge. So, having gone into depth of field, you are going to need to set your camera on aperture priority. And you do that on this camera by pushing the mode button and rotating this wheel until A appears there. That button here says exposure compensation. There are occasions when a shot can come out overexposed or underexposed, and a typical one would be a very, very dark patient where the exposure might not be correct. So if you want to make him or her lighter, you would push that button and rotate that wheel, and you'd have a plus or a minus thing on here. And if you do that, it doesn't upset all the rest of your previous settings. So odd occasion, something is incorrect, push the button, adjust the exposure up or down until you get the right one. So there we're set for maximum depth of field, f22, the automatic shutter speed on the Nikon, a 60th, aperture priority, fine quality, white balance, there's the lightning sign, and the battery needs charging. And this is your compensation. That is plus, that's minus, and a little slider will move along there. So that's set for an intraoral shot. What would you now do? What would you want to see if you're taking a face? Yeah. The reason that you need to change is that these flash guns are designed for close-up work. And I was actually thinking about putting a slide in of, believe it or not, a toilet. Because if you equate this to the cistern and you pull the handle, then it will empty out all the contents. So if I'm taking a shot of a face at f22 from here, it's going to be underexposed because there is not enough guts in this flash gun to illuminate a subject at 2 meters. So therefore you open up the aperture. That's the only reason. But you have all the depth of field that you need when you're that much further away. So the Canon slightly differs from the Nikon on its information panel, but it's all there. Your aperture, sensitivity, aperture priority, flash, electronic flash of the white balance, manual focus, fine image, large file, battery needs charging, 400 shots left. So you now want to take some pictures of your X-ray, and your camera settings for this need to be changed. You're going to take the shots without flash. So if you uprate the sensitivity, you can use a fairly fast shutter speed. So I would suggest 800. You would either look at your light box to see the color temperature of your flash, of the tubes in the light box, and then go to custom setting, and you can set the white balance to the Kelvin color degrees. Once again, I said earlier on, I'm only going to talk about one system, which was the digital single lens reflex. I suppose in a way I lied. Because some of you, I'm not saying all of you, some of you may only want a full face or a half face. I doubt it now, having seen what's going on, because I think you will all need occlusal views. And also there was an email from somebody, could I have a small camera that was good for clinical use and good for social use? So this is one I've been playing around with. One of the problems is the lens is down here and the flash is there. So at close-ups you are bound to get some sort of shadowing. That again is taken against the white screen, but it's perfectly adequate. Is there an alternative to electronic flash? Well, you may or may not have noticed modern cars, Mercedes in particular, Audi in particular, have got a series of LED lights instead of a normal single bulb side light. And LEDs, light emitting diodes, have improved over the years. They're very bright, and there are some designed for clinical use. Now that one neatly fits around that little camera and is not bad for intraoral views. But I will never achieve that same size again accurately, because it's going to depend, number one is where I stand, and number two is where the zoom setting is on the camera. So yep, if you're not particular on consistency, it would do, but really I wouldn't recommend it. And also it's very, very difficult to take mirror shots in it with it. The other question was that the new cameras, such as the Nikon 1, the Olympus Pen, have a compact sized body but adjustable, or a choice of lenses. Now, yes, they're very neat, very small, but that body is the same cost as the average single lens reflex body. By the time you put a long lens on it, it becomes very unwieldy. And at the moment, I don't think there are any flash systems for them. So I think they're not at the minute. You can think about less formal views. And that's the LED unit for a digital single lens reflex. It's very good, but at £750 is a lot of money. So you can have some comments on these. So one of my comments, that's all you need. Argue with me if you wish. We've got uneven lighting, inconsistent sizes, fogged mirror down bottom left here, poor focus here, poor exposure. Now, am I correct in assuming if you're going to take a study model, you want a vertical view, not at an angle like those? Yeah, fine. That is the sort of shadowing you would get if you use that little Lumix camera on that sort of shot, because the flash is to one side.